In this lesson, you're going to understand the difference between a eulogy and an elegy. You will explore cultural concepts about the landscape regarding prairies and bogs. You'll explore the language in detail used to praise and celebrate the subject matter. You'll study how precise meaning is crafted in literary language. You'll deconstruct and explore different sentence types and how they're used by the poet. And then you'll explore the creation of the poetic voice and the viewpoint. A eulogy is a speech or piece of writing that praises someone or something very highly. It's often given at a funeral. An elegy, however, in terms of literature, is a poem of serious reflection, typically a lament for the dead or the lost. Most of the time, we think about eulogies praising people when they've passed away, but we can eulogize other things, and synonyms for that include to extol, to commend, to celebrate, to laud, to applaud, to flatter, to fate, to lionize, and to praise. Theodore Rutka was an American poet whose work is characterized by his introspection, his rhythm, and natural imagery. He has a highly respected reputation as a leading American poet from the 20th century, and his poem In Praise of Prairie is often linked and compared to Heaney's Bogland, which may well have inspired it. In Praise of Prairie. The elm tree is our highest mountain peak, a 5-foot drop of valley, so to speak. A man's head is an eminence upon a field of barley spread beneath the sun. Horizons have no strangeness to the eye. Our feet are sometimes level with the sky. When we are walking on a treeless plain, with ankles bruised from stubble of the grain, the fields stretch out in long unbroken rows. We walk aware of what is far and close. Here, distance is familiar as a friend. The feud we kept with space comes to an end. Rutka's poem looks at the American prairies, a vast swathe of grassland in the Midwestern states, and he praises the openness, the grandeur of that vast, unending tract of land. Throughout the 19th century, Americans moved from the eastern coasts across and went west, travelling across the vast plainlands, as you can see in the map here. The homesteaders and pioneers, as they were known, travelled further and further, taking civilization through what were Native American territories. The culture of the plains has been celebrated since in numerous artists' romanticizing of the wildness, the wilderness, and the savagery of the so-called uncivilized lands. As society and civilization moved west, the heroes of the land were those who were taking control of it, bringing the cattle, and these heroes, the cowboys, the pioneers, have been romanticized in American art ever since. Here you can see this rider guarding the train of carriages on what was the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail became a route for thousands of people to move to new lands, to find places to set up their own farming areas, new cities, new towns, and particularly for religious communities to move away from areas and find their own free places to worship. This is partly what is celebrated in Rutka's eulogy to American history, to American culture, that huge, great transformation of the nation. This trail became important in American civilization and the growth of the dominance of white people in America. The culture of the taking of this land has been romanticized and documented and explored throughout the whole of westernized Western stories, and even into the 20th century, especially into the 1950s, in Western movies. Apart from the popular culture and stories of cowboys and things like that, you also had this romanticized exploration of the wilderness movement and the glorification of open spaces. Rather like the Romanticism in Europe, Americans looked to the wilderness to see the unspoilt nature, the beauty of unspoilt nature and all its glory, and that is being praised in much of the literature. In writing Bogland, Heaney is drawing a direct comparison between America and Ireland. If you look at this map, you can see how tiny Ireland actually is in terms of land area compared to just one of the states almost of America. Heaney is conscious of the massive scale of America and the huge expanse of the prairies, and he looks back at his own island and sees the tininess of it, and yet he still wants to celebrate and praise the thing that is Ireland, the thing that is the bogland. Heaney has clearly seen the prairies, he's seen the sun, and interestingly the sun is sliced at evening. A big sun is sliced at evening, suggesting that the prairies and the skies are so massive that they dwarf the sun to something small and sliceable. So Bogland is Seamus Heaney's attempt to capture the landscape of Ireland, to celebrate it, to see its expanse, very different to the prairies, but still important and essential for him to put down on paper. Before we read the poem, we need to look at the dedication for T.P. Flanagan and think about the title and this dedication, Bogland. And rather than Ireland, he takes Bogland because the bogs have been in Ireland for thousands of years. It is a land of bogs. Ireland for many people is synonymous with the bogs. The pejorative slang terms for Ireland have been terrible in terms of things like bog trotters and the identification with the bogs through the mass production of peat. So Ireland is synonymous here with Bogland. But the dedication is for T.P. Flanagan, the artist who has done in paint what Heaney is seeking to do in verse here. He captures in paint the nuances, the colours, the tones, the mood, the atmosphere of Ireland. And he does it in a very abstract, expressionistic way. If you look at this painting by Flanagan, you can see that it is abstract in the sense of capturing colour, mood, texture, and yet it is not clearly defined. It's a suggestion, an evocation. And Heaney admired this work so much that Flanagan actually painted a few paintings for him. Seamus Heaney, for whom he painted various pieces, described Flanagan as being in tune with the notion of an earthly paradise, and hence the radiance of the painting is entirely this worldly, and always there has been that necessary painterly hedonism. Hedonism is the indulgence and enjoying of pleasure beyond moral restraint or cultural restraint almost. And in each of the poems, in each of the paintings, Flanagan is indulging in his delight as an artist. And so by definition we can see how Heaney indulges as a poet in a hedonistic approach to capturing Ireland in verse. By definition, abstract art extracts from the source material things that are significant, bold marks, blocks of colour. And so Heaney by definition will be capturing something in sound, in verse, in texture, or focusing on specific things that are significant and stand out for him.
Bogland for T.P. Flanagan. Center is bottomless.
Now that you've heard the poem, I want you to go back and look at the poem itself and then think about what kind of sentences Heaney is using. But before you do that, just remind yourself of the 4 different basic types. If you've looked at the poem, you'll see that every line of it is a simple declarative. We just have a simple list of Heaney listing things about the land, about the place that he knows. If you go back then and look at the bits that I've highlighted in green, everywhere is wooed, butter was recovered. He uses 2 passive voice forms. It's as if things are done to the land. Similarly, there are some negatives here. They have no prairies. The country is unfenced. Things are melting, missing. Or he defines it as what it won't be, not what it is. They'll never dig coal here. And the wet centre is bottomless. There's a sense of mystery about this place in that he is defining the place as what it's not as much as what it is. It is a bogland because it is neither water nor land. It's an intermittent amorphous state between 2 states. And there's a sense of mystery about that as he tries to define it and come to terms with what it actually is. Growing up in Ireland, as we saw in digging the peat, living off the land, Irish people in that community used it for fuel, sold it for fuel, but it wasn't coal. It was something particularly Irish, and they turned it over and dried it out to create the fuel, as you can see in these images here. Coming from this community, Heaney is very conscious of the tradition, the culture, and by writing digging and now bogland, he finds his voice. He defines who he is in the culture that is bogland, and yet it's something that's mysterious and not quite definable because it isn't solid land. In this painting you can see the workers digging hard, creating their mounds of peat to dry out. As it dries out, the water drains and the peat itself crusts over. But as they dig, they discover, just as in Rutka's poem on the prairies, he recalls the heroes of the past and the American bison and the grand landscape. In ancient Ireland, Heaney calls up the elk and the primitive societies that would have hunted that. In this picture you can see the size and massive scan of this huge prehistoric deer, extinct for centuries but now dug up and its skeleton still found today. If we look at the text closely, the use of the pronouns we and our has Heaney speaking for the Irish people again, being the voice of his community. If you look closely, we see the use of the sibilants into slice a big sun, and that visceral sound of that slicing of the sun evokes the frisson of that moment. Similarly, he uses the fricative from prairies to concedes and horizon to create that echoing sound. In encroaching and crusting, you have an internal rhyme, but it is those rhymes that sort of sing out in the middle of it. We have no prairies to slice a big sun at evening. Everywhere the eye concedes to encroaching horizon, is wooed into the cyclops eye of a tarn. Our unfenced country is bog that keeps crusting between the sights of the sun. And interestingly, there's the encroaching horizon that crusts. There the sun in Ireland is big and dries out the bog, whereas in America the prairies are massive and they slice the big sun. Interestingly, the encroaching horizon makes Ireland seem small, so that everything is forced down into the tarn, the small pool of water collecting in the base of a valley. A tarn is a small pool of water that's collected at the top of a river, a valley, often the meltwater originally from glaciers and things, but in modern times it's the collected rainwater that's high up in the valleys. But it's always a small pool of water, and in the landscape it reflects the light like an eye, hence Heaney's use of the metaphor. It's related to the classical myth of the cyclops, which just has one eye, and he uses that to bring to that landscape a sense of living nature, a metaphoric creature. In these stanzas we see the construction of the myth of Ireland, the Great Irish Elk, an ancient deer that has been found, as we've seen already, in Ireland, and it's called the Great Irish Elk, as if it's some mythic great beast that is particularly Irish rather than just having to be found there. And that modifier great elevates it, aggrandizes the prehistoric culture of Ireland. The fact he uses the pronoun they've taken the skeleton. They've taken it because they are different. They are the people, the scientists, whoever. Someone has taken it. the skeleton of that creature, and they've set it up as if that's elevating it to some huge status to be looked up to. And yet metaphorically it is a crate full of air. It is a huge nothing. A crate because that evokes the spindly structure of it, and it's astounding because it's survived, it's lasted, it's huge. In the next stanza, butter sunk under more than 100 years was recovered salty and white. A simple declarative. The assonance of those short vowel U's punctuate that sentence. Simplistic factual statements. Butter sunk under more than 100 years was recovered salty and white. We see the astounding magical quality of the landscape that preserves even something like butter, and then he takes the image of the butter and he makes it a metaphor. The ground itself is kind black butter. The ground is personified. It has a generous nature. It preserves. It keeps Ireland Irish like black butter. The beauty of that nurturing black peat. Finally, notice that rhyme, internal rhyme, the astounding crate and the ground itself. Throughout the poem, Heaney is consistently looking for links. It's a fluctuating poem that is a list of statements, but there's no regular rhythm or rhyme. In fact, the ends do not stop. The lines run over, they enjambe across different stanzas, so the ground itself is kind black butter, melting and opening underfoot, missing its last definition by millions of years. And just as peat is amorphous, it's not solid. The structure of the poem melds ideas and sentences into a long, fluid development. This little slide just shows the geological processes of turning peat into coal, and so you get all of the leaf litter, the trees and everything that decay fall into the water, and they break down, create layers of peat. Over time that water goes partially and forms the black, wet, so partially solidified parts of peat, and then over time trees, processes compress that into coal, and then with the heat of the earth as well, it forms the bedrock of coal. And that does not happen in Ireland. That third stage is missing, and so you have this semi-solid land. Here it is that black, metaphoric black butter that's melting and opening underfoot, missing its last definition by millions of years. The last definition, the last point in the process of developing the peat is the formation of coal, and that hasn't happened here. The plant material has collected in the valleys, it has been kept wet, it has never been compressed and dried out or pressured by other layers of rock to create the coal. So it's melting, missing millions of years. This land has been here for a long time. The peat has taken all that time to form and to develop, and it's never been able to progress. They'll never dig coal here. Again, that pronoun refers to these vague people who do things on the Irish landscape, whether they're scientists digging up the elk or the bodies or whatever it is they discover in the peat, or whether it's the men digging the peat. They will never dig coal here. Again, that negative, Ireland defined by something it isn't. It doesn't have coal. And then the deictic pronoun here. Here is different. This is island. It's different. Only the waterlogged trunks of great firs, soft as pulp. The great firs reminds us of the great elk, two huge great things from the past, lost and gone, but here preserved. And the short vowels again, waterlogged trunks, soft pulp. Our pioneers keep striking. Notice that possessive pronoun, our pioneers, not the American ones who went west. Our pioneers are exploring, and where do they go? They keep striking inwards and downwards, exploring into the heart and the depths of Ireland. If we remember what Heaney wanted to do in digging, he wanted to dig with his pen. He digs with his verse and explores Ireland, and he does that here. And similarly, he wants to look into the culture in personal Helicon, and here he is looking inwards, downwards, to uncover Ireland. And then years later we can see how the peat is cut into strips, turfs, sods, stacked up and dried, ready to be sold on for burning. And in these you can see a modern day equivalent, and there they've discovered something. And on the right you can see the remnants of a human form, the shoulders and arms of a bog body, the head missing. Today Ireland is still being stripped of peat. Every layer they strip seems camped on before. The bog holes might be Atlantic seepage. The wet centre is bottomless. Heaney ends the poem with two simple statements. Every layer they strip seems camped on before. And so as each layer of peat is stripped back, they discover the past. They uncover the history, the primeval bogs that unearth what Ireland was in prehistory. It's been camped on before because life, like the contemporary culture, like the contemporary people of Ireland, is all temporary. The ephemeral nature of any culture, therefore, is not as significant as the longevity of the peat, the Irish past that we discover in the poem. It isn't Ireland, it's Bogland, because it was Bogland before Ireland. Interestingly, the bog holes might be Atlantic seepage, as if there isn't any foundation to Ireland, as if it's just a floating mass of peat, and the Atlantic itself, the ocean, might be seeping in. The wet centre is bottomless. Bottomless in the sense that it's a mysterious, fathomless deep, but also metaphorically, that there is no bottom to knowing the full mystery of the boglands.
Bogland for T.P. Flanagan. center is bottomless.
In Neil Corcoran's study of Heaney, he says of Bogland, "This poem concludes Door into the Dark and is very much a new beginning rather than an ending, appearing to contain within itself the excitement of the capacity for further extension and development, a different rhythm." In an interview, Heaney says that it was the first poem of mine that I felt had the status of symbol in some way. It wasn't trapped in its own anecdote or its own closing off. It seemed to have some kind of wind blowing through it that could carry on. And the wind did, of course, carry on through the sequence of bog poems initiated by the Tolland Mand and others in Wintering Out, and was brought to its fulfilment in North. So Bogland may be regarded as a kind of answering the Irish poem to Theodore Rutka's American In Praise of Prairie, in which horizons have no strangeness to the eye, and distance is familiar as a friend, the feud we kept with space comes to an end. That same American pioneering spirit which looks outwards and upwards to fulfillment through movement, advance, exploration, openness, and of course conquest, is countered by Heaney's negative definition of Irish topographical experience. We have no prairies to slice a big sun at evening. We look inwards and downwards into the bottomless centre of our own history, recovering there the traces and treasures of previous cultures and peoples, just as the bogland of Ireland literally preserves historical and prehistorical deposits which may be released by archaeology. The sense of excited possibility in Bogland, however, derives not only from Heaney's first use of the figure which is to act so powerfully in subsequent poems, the bog as metaphor, but also from the fact that this poem itself describes its own lack of closure in containment in the act of describing its overt subject. The ground itself is kind black butter, melting and opening underfoot, missing its last definition by millions of years. Describing the ground here, the poem is also describing itself. Its own falling rhythms and constantly enjambed lines melt and open too, in the notification that the symbol of the bog itself will melt and open again. In embedding within itself a commentary on itself in this way, Bogland initiates that process of almost constant self-commentary in Heaney's later work, and initiates therefore a more sophisticated and subtle kind of Heaney poem.